So I did Frostblink traps because I thought it would be funny at first, and while I don't think I can recommend doing this unless for fun, it was surprisingly not bad. Not great, but I was able to do Uber Shaper and Eater with it, so I guess that makes it technically uber viable. Now I may have died in almost every inescapable Doom phase, but I think that's just a player skill issue, right? Because I can never see which way the big tentacles are gonna fall. I wouldn't do Uber Exarch or Cirrus though, since you want a blink skill to get over the fireballs and the spinny beams. This build uses a blink skill as a main skill, so you can't really add another blink like Flame Dash for mobility because they share cooldowns and it makes everything really awkward. Now the reason I went with traps is because I like the playstyle and it feels a lot better in a lot of scenarios like bossing, harvest, expedition, altars, essences, even just mapping in an open layout. With a build like this though, you're gonna have to try to squeeze as much DPS out of it as you can. And going with traps isn't actually too much of a DPS decrease, even though you have to use the awful trap support gem. This is mostly due to traps having better DPS uptime because you can throw traps at a range, and you'll have elemental overload up more than self-cast since you'll be able to throw traps much more often due to the additional cooldown use and the ranged playstyle. Also, having to blink on top of a boss to do damage is really uncomfortable. Okay, so the only reason this build exists is because of this item. Bronn's Lithe gives an easy 5 levels, and I was able to find a +2 corrupted one for really cheap, like 30 chaos. And I don't know if I was lucky, but it only took like 8 tainted fusings to 6-link it from a 4-link. With an easy +7 from bronze, +1 from both my weapon and amulet, and a 21 gem, we get a level 30 Frostblink, which hits really hard. Due to the cooldown though, Ignite's probably how you want to do it, so we're an Elementalist, which allows all our damage to ignite, and to get that 25% more damage, we're using Cold to Fire to make most of our damage fire. The thing with trap-based Elementalists though is you'll need to find another way to proc your convergence, since traps don't count as you in this scenario. So I have Stormbrand with Hex Touch Flammability and Culling Strike. We miss out on the Doom from self-casting the curse, but adding another button to press is a bit much, since we're also using Flame Surge for the Burning Ground. You can opt to use Arcanist Brand with Flammability and Flame Surge, but the duration's too short for my liking and it's kinda awkward since we want Convergence before our Frostblinks ignite and Flame Surge's Burning Ground after. For the last Ascendancy point, I went with Golems cause I had some sockets to spare and I liked the regen from Stone Golem. And since we're not stacking too much armor, the Fizz reduction from Chaos Golem is pretty good too. We give up like a 1650 elemental shield, which would be pretty nice considering our low life pool. However, we're not too concerned about elemental damage since we have some max res and we're also using Divine Flesh. I'm only running 87% chaos res, but I think it would be worth using another Born of Chaos for 90 in a couple levels. Running 2 small chaos clusters also makes gearing a bit easier since I'm relying on my cluster and timeless jewels for chaos res. Speaking of which, looking for a good glorious vanity is a pretty horrible experience, especially at this point in the league. I just used PoB's built-in Timeless Jewel Finder. I'm sure there are better ones out there though. Yeah, so make sure you actually get useful stats on your Glorious Vanity. I'm getting the last bit of spell suppression and chaos reds that I needed. You can also get ailment avoid on these, so I think it's a good way to fill out small quantities of a bunch of stats that you need to cap. Getting 100% spell suppression is kinda rough as an Elementalist, so I'm using an Impossible Escape for precise technique to get the suppression here, some dex, cause Bronze Life requires like 145, and some life and ailment avoid too. This also helps us get 100% ailment avoidance in conjunction with my anointed crystal skin and some decent rolls on my shield and boots. Oh, by the way, this here, not a skin transfer, I'm actually using a rot gut. It's unironically really good if you have minimum frenzy charges. The minimum charges can't get consumed, but you still get the onslaught cause it's based on how many charges you had on use, not how many it consumed. So if you have minimum frenzy charges, you can get onslaught pretty easily with rot gut. I'm getting my minimum charges from Grand Spectrum. I went this route because, well, I already had them, and also the resistances from the endurance charges helps ease the burden on my rare items, since we are very suffix starved from needing chaos res and dex in addition to max res, spell suppress, and ailment avoid. Additionally, we're a bit lacking in the physical mitigation department, so the extra 12% is also really nice. I'm running Determination and Granite to get some armor though, because it's still really helpful against rapid small hits. Since we're using Divine Flesh, I have a Forbidden Taste triggered on Savage Hip, and we don't have to worry about the downsides. This will save you a lot, especially in boss fights. Now some of you may have noticed that some of my flasks change throughout the video. Versus bosses, I swap out my Jade Flask for a Diamond Flask for better uptime on Elemental Overload. The evasion is nice when mapping, but doesn't really help you versus bosses, so you're not really missing anything. I also started using a life flask instead of a granite on bosses too, cause I found that I was just running out of life slowly, especially in stuff like Uber Shaper's bullet hell phase where there was no way my golem was surviving. Also, I swapped Determination for Hatred cause the tiny amount of armor you get won't really help, and Hatred gives us like 20% more damage. A white socket is really useful in this situation. Yeah, I don't know why I'm talking as if I'm expecting anyone to try this, but leveling this character was probably one of the smoothest experiences I've had. I mainly used Fire Trap. Once I got Shaper of Flames and some cooldown recovery on the tree, I was able to just self-cast Frostblink in a 4-link to get through the campaign, with Fire Trap for single target. In the PoE, I've included snapshots of my character during leveling so you can see what I was using to get these results.